Hello Liz, lovely to meet you.
Hi.
We're going to talk about your new book coming out on Thursday, The Cunning Women.
Yes.
What kind of research do you do and how long do you spend researching before beginning a book?
Yes, when it comes to researching, I'm more of a writer who sort of leaps in and starts writing than planning generally. So obviously with historical fiction you can't quite do that. When I wrote Cunning Women, it was actually a documentary that I watched about the Pendle Witch trials, which was the inspiration for it. And so there's a lot of information about the Pendle Witch trials that you can find. So I did some reading around it. I read other fiction that was set in the same period, and there's a lot of documentaries as well that I watched. But I did some research, then I started writing, and then I occasionally would bump it up against something that I didn't know and had to do a bit more research. And so I researched, wrote, carried on researching, sort of amalgamated and went along together really. When it comes to writing historical characters, obviously there are some restrictions in terms of what they can do and what their lives would be, and particularly in the way that they would speak, I suppose. But I actually found that quite freeing in a way, because it sort of challenges you to think about the language in a different way. And I know that when I was writing Cunning Women, there was a scene from Sarah's point of view where she comes in, she's feeling angry, she looks at her mother, and I wanted to say that her anger evaporated, but obviously I didn't think that she would use that word. And so I think I wrote in the end it thinned and spread, and I just really enjoyed having that challenge, which made you kind of come at the language from a slightly different angle, and the rhythms of how they would have spoken were different, and I actually found it bizarrely quite freeing to be writing historical fiction. The most difficult scene to write was one near the end. I don't want to go into too much detail in case it's a spoiler, but it's quite a brutal scene, and the character who is involved in that scene is really frightened, and I just found it so upsetting to write, not so much because of the brutality but because of how the character was feeling, and as I wrote it I felt quite ill really. I had a headache and I felt sick, so not in terms of putting the scene together because it's quite late in the book and I knew the characters well, but in terms of how it made me feel, that was definitely the most difficult scene to write. As a Wendy Roby, thank you. My interesting writing quirk is probably my inability to plan anything that I write. I need the idea to still be fresh, I think, and be excited by it. So I do have a tendency to leap in and start writing, and sometimes it works quite well, and sometimes I end up having to sort of pull back and delete a load of words that I've written and go off in a different direction. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but that's definitely my quirk, I think. I don't know if I would, personally, I don't know if I would use the word spiritual to describe writing, but I mean it does take you to a different plane, I suppose, really, when you're creating something like that and seeing it all. I see it all so strongly in my head, so I do think it sort of takes you out of your everyday life, and it also kind of makes you feel very much in your own skin as well. So I suppose, yes, it is. I can see why people might describe it as spiritual. Joe Williams, that's a great question. If I could talk to any accused witch in history, I think it would be Alison Device, who was the eldest daughter in the family that was involved in the Pendle Witch trials, because it was what happened to her that began the whole thing. She was out one day and she met a peddler and she asked to beg some pins from him. When he refused, she became very upset and angry, and she cursed him. And he was so afraid of her. She was just a young girl, she was only a teenager. But he was so terrified of her that he had what we now know to be a stroke. And she was overcome with remorse, and she actually went and confessed to the magistrate, and that began that whole terrible set of events. And I've always felt very moved by that story, so I think Alison Device, yeah. Ooh, when it comes to choosing names for characters, that's it can be tricky, can't it? Especially if you're writing something set in 1620. So I did quite a lot of research on sort of Lancashire surnames of the 17th century, and also you know, it's more than that, isn't it? You also want to have a feeling that that name is right for that character. So I know Sarah and Annie, those names just felt in tune with the character. And then sometimes I like to choose a name like Seth. When I think of a Seth, I think of somebody very sort of strong and decisive, but actually Seth in the book is not that really. He finds life very challenging, he's very gentle. So sometimes I like a name that kind of contradicts the character as well, but it is a fun part of the writing process. At the time that I was writing Cunning Women, I was very busy. Actually, I had 2 jobs. I was struggling to make ends meet. Both of my teenagers were still at home. And I also didn't know that the book was going to get published. And so at the time, I didn't really have the time or the finances to do a lot in terms of going to places and researching. So I didn't specifically go to Lancashire. But you know, I did go to places where there were ruins that would have been around at this time. And it was really fascinating to look at the outline of the stone walls and how, you know, the houses would have been just the 2 rooms, and I really could imagine my characters living there, so that was really helpful.
Do you have any advice for writers starting out and wanting to write historical fiction?
Hi, Jennifer Reeve. Yes, I mean, I think the experience is different for every writer, isn't it, really? So I think any advice I could give would just be to find your own way to do it, and whatever works for you, just embrace it. And don't worry if somebody else is writing 1,000 words a day, or, you know, if they have a different process to you. You know, there is no right way. The right way is just the way that works for you. And also, the other thing I would say is perhaps just give yourself permission to do it, you know, make time for it, and I felt terribly guilty when I first started writing that I should have been playing with the children or cleaning the bathroom or something, but if it's important to you, give yourself permission to make time to do it and take it seriously, and absolutely best of luck.
I understand that you're in the process of writing another book. Yes. Do you want each book that you write to stand on its own, or are you trying to build a body of work with connections between each book?
No, I wish I could build a body of work that had connections between each book, but I don't think I have that ability really. I think each book is just a complete story to me. So the story of Sarah and Daniel, I wrote to the end of what I wanted to write about. And my next book is set in a different era, and it's about very different characters. But I do think that you sort of return to the same themes that interest you, and you know, I'm interested in outsiders, and I'm interested in love and all of the forms of love between siblings and parents and children, in this case Sarah and Daniel, and womanhood, and how being a woman is, you know, different and challenging in different eras of history. So I think those themes will probably return, but the actual stories and characters will be different.
Do you hide any secrets in your books that only a few people will find?
Do I hide any secrets in my books? Again, I wish I was that clever, really. The only thing that is sort of hidden in Cunning Women is, I think I told you I was listening to a lot of the Decemberists when I wrote this book, and there is one particular song which very clearly in my head relates to a particular scene in the book, and there is actually buried in a line of dialogue in that scene, there are 3 words from that Decemberist song that just for me made that connection, but I would be very surprised if anybody found it. You'd have to be a great Decemberists fan, and you'd have to be really reading the book microscopically to find it.
That's a great challenge.
Yeah.
If you could tell your younger writing self anything, what would it be?
If I could go back and talk to my young writing self, I would say, well, again, I think it would be, don't feel guilty, give yourself permission to do it, because I think I wasted a lot of time sort of worrying that it was a bit frivolous and I shouldn't really do it. And also, it's a bit of a cliche, but it is, you know, it is actually right, and it has been right in my case. Don't give up. You know, I had a lot of rejections and there were periods where I got very despondent and I stopped writing for a few months, and you know, actually I think it's important to remember that when you get that rejection, it's not a rejection of the whole of your work and the way that you write. It just means that that particular editor or agent or market isn't a right fit for that particular story that you've sent off. So it doesn't mean your work is bad, it just means you need to keep looking. Yeah.